What if the greatest empire of the modern era was never built with armies, but with spreadsheets? What if the true rulers of the world were not presidents, kings, or generals, but institutions capable of creating money out of nothing and lending it to entire nations? Today, global debt surpasses $315 trillion, 4 times the size of the world's entire GDP. Every minute, governments borrow an additional $1 billion just to keep the system from collapsing. And yet, almost nobody asks the most uncomfortable question: who really profits from a world permanently in debt? Because behind every crisis, every bailout, every market shock, and every war that needed funding, there has always been a shadow network of power brokers, influential enough to reshape the destiny of countries and invisible enough to never be held accountable. Nothing in the global economy is as simple as it seems, and nothing about debt is accidental. Here, where history, power, and economics converge, we uncover the structures most people were never meant to question. We live in the most indebted era in human history. Countries that appear wealthy, like the United States, Japan, and Italy, are also among the most indebted. Meanwhile, nations portrayed as irresponsible often owe money not because they failed, but because someone needed them to borrow. The paradox is brutal. Debt weakens nations, yet the entire world depends on debt to function. Interest payments become the quiet taxes of modern empires. Developing nations send over $400 billion every year to creditors in New York, London, Frankfurt, and Beijing, money that could have funded schools, infrastructure, or hospitals. The public believes debt is a national flaw, but history tells another story entirely. Debt is not a mistake. Debt is a system, and the system serves someone. Everything is connected. To understand how debt became a tool of global control, we must go back to empires that financed wars with borrowed gold, to the 19th century when European bankers discovered that lending to governments was more profitable than lending to merchants. In 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, London bankers realized a fatal truth: an empire funded by debt expands faster than one funded by taxes. Soon, the most powerful states began issuing government bonds to finance armies, colonies, railways, and industrial expansion. Banks bought the bonds, investors followed, and suddenly entire nations were locked into long-term obligations that would shape their political decisions for decades. Then came Bretton Woods, 1944. A devastated world needed rebuilding, and the United States offered a new model: international institutions capable of lending massive sums in exchange for structural influence. The IMF, the World Bank, and later global bond markets rewired the world economy around one central idea: a country's sovereignty now depended on its creditors. Debt had become the new battlefield, and credit the new empire. Today, the system operates through a simple yet devastating architecture. Governments issue bonds, banks buy them, central banks manipulate interest rates, rating agencies judge which nations deserve cheap money and which must suffer, hedge funds speculate, investment funds demand austerity. The IMF steps in when things collapse. Every actor plays a role in a mechanism that transforms national debt into international dependence. It works like a machine with hidden gears. Bonds create obligation, interest rates create discipline, ratings create fear, bailouts create compliance, austerity creates submission. The public sees numbers, the insiders see leverage. And leverage in geopolitics is power.
No country owes money to just one creditor. Brazil borrows from China, trades with the US, and owes interest to European bondholders. Italy depends on its own banks to buy its bonds, while those same banks depend on liquidity from the European Central Bank. African nations borrow from Chinese development banks and Western private funds simultaneously. This is the global paradox. Debt creates conflict, and yet debt also binds everyone together. If one nation defaults, investors panic. If investors panic, currencies fall. If currencies fall, banks collapse. If banks collapse, governments fall. Nobody can afford for another to fail. yet everyone profits from keeping the others permanently indebted. It is a cycle with no exit. Above governments sits a quieter elite. Bond traders who can crash currencies in a single afternoon. Rating agencies whose grades determine the fate of millions. Central bankers who set interest rates that can save or ruin nations. Hedge funds capable of shorting entire economies. And global institutions that lend with one hand and dictate policy with the other. These actors do not need to conquer countries. They simply control the cost of money. And when money becomes expensive, nations obey. Argentina learned this in 2001, Greece in 2010, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every crisis reveals the same truth. Creditors are not just lenders, they are architects of destiny. Look at Greece, forced into crippling austerity as unemployment soared above 27% just to ensure bondholders were repaid. Look at Argentina, trapped in a century-long cycle of borrowing, defaulting, renegotiating, and borrowing again. Its sovereignty mortgaged to foreign creditors. Look at Lebanon, whose 2019 financial meltdown erased life savings overnight. Look at Africa, where nations spend more servicing debt than they do on education. Behind every statistical collapse lies a human collapse. Lost jobs, closed hospitals, abandoned cities, broken hopes. These crises are not isolated failures. They are the predictable outcomes of a system in which debt grows faster than the ability to pay it. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The global debt system was never designed to be repaid. If every country paid every debt, the system would collapse in a single day. Banks would lose their safest assets. Investors would lose their interest income. Central banks would lose their tools of influence. Governments would lose the mechanism that keeps their economies growing. Debt is not supposed to end. Debt is supposed to expand. It is the engine behind global finance, the quiet machine that keeps money flowing upward toward those who control the credit lines. At the core of this entire architecture, there is no gold, no vault, no treasure, only trust. Trust that bonds will be repaid. Trust that currencies will retain value. Trust that governments will honor obligations. Trust that the system will keep working tomorrow. If trust disappears, if investors doubt, if central banks miscalculate, if nations rebel, the entire edifice shatters. Because the global debt system is not built on payment. It is built on belief. Break the belief, and you break the system. And while the world borrows, a small group collects. Interest payments flow upward from taxpayers to investors, from governments to private funds, from developing nations to global creditors. It is not ideology. It is architecture. A structure designed to concentrate wealth, centralize influence, and turn economic dependence into geopolitical advantage. The higher the debt, the more powerful the creditors. The system rewards those who lend and punishes those who are forced to borrow. In the end, debt is not numbers on a screen. It is a promise, one that defines the fate of nations. Every empire has its currency, but only the modern empire rules through obligation rather than conquest.